Brands like Uniqlo, Mango, Primark, and Aritzia are expanding rapidly in the United States.
Inditex, which owns Zara, Fast Retailing, that owns Uniqlo, other names such as Mango and Primark, they've expanded a great deal internationally, particularly in Europe and other areas. And the US is still an under-penetrated, under-tapped market for them. These are also retailers that have a great deal of international expertise.
From 2018 to 20...
This is interesting. I feel like we recently spoke about Uniqlo, and I've definitely heard of these other brands. These brands do seem to be a lot more popular in Europe, for instance. I know folks who generally are from that area, more so than the US, and they seem to be particularly interested in these types of brands. Like Mango, for instance, I have very limited exposure to it myself, but it does seem to be something that other folks that I'm familiar with seem to use and seem to appreciate as a brand. And so it's curious how some of these trends are sort of shaping the US market and how we're shopping for clothing. And some of them have become very trusted brands. I know Uniqlo, they seem to be kind of a lower price point option. And that one seems to have taken some segments of the population by storm, and they will swear by it and have like an entire wardrobe just from Uniqlo, for instance. And I've sometimes seen it for other of these brands that they've sort of mentioned as well, like Primark or Mango, for instance. So I'm curious to see what they're going to share on this topic.
2023, there were nearly 19,000 US store openings. About 30% of those were foreign-owned companies.
The rise of foreign retailers is especially prevalent in American shopping malls. I just walked into Queens Center in New York, and the first thing I see is a Primark, which is next to a Zara, which is right across from an H&M.
The US is the number one consumer market, so to be here and to get it right means a lot, but you really need to get it right.
I have something similar. It's by a brand, Reigns. It looks very similar to that, but this is a lot less expensive.
Primark is still a very new player, but it could pose competitive threats for mall names that people are more familiar with. I spoke to a shopper. He was looking for a pair of sneakers and brought a coupon to go to Macy's. But he ended up going into Primark, walking out with a $22 pair of shoes, and he never made it to the department store.
So what makes the US so appealing to these foreign?
Yeah, Primark is especially known for being cheap clothing. I don't know about all of you, but feel free to post in the comments if you have opinions on it. But I feel like Primark is almost known for having maybe too cheap of clothing, like clothing that will sort of fall apart after a number of fairly easy uses. I think H&M falls in that same category for me, and I think that's where, again, I feel like, at least for myself, maybe I'm biased from at least some of the research that I've done. I think Uniqlo is one of those brands that I believe is supposed to be like standard quality at a cheap price. And so it's what you would normally expect. You can wear it multiple times. You could wear it maybe for a year or more if you treat your clothing items properly. Whereas I believe Primark and H&M, I've seen some people complain about them falling apart after like a week if you use that item every day. I'm not sure about their shoes, as they said in this example. And I'm fairly certain Mango, that they've also referenced here, is supposed to be an even higher quality brand. I think it's under the umbrella of one of the other brands that they've mentioned. I think it might be Zara. And Mango might be under the same core base, sort of like how Gap and I think Banana Republic might be the same company. And so they have different price point options for different consumer segments. And again, I think this is where some of these seem to be particularly cheap, but people also really liked this at that time because you could find items that were so much cheaper than the alternatives here in the US.
Foreign brands. And why do shoppers love them so much? Primark opened its first store in Dublin back in 1969, where it is known as Pennies, a nod to the store's distinguishingly low prices. The Irish discount retailer has grown its presence in the United States to 29 stores.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that was the case. I've never heard of Pennies before, but that does make sense. It was, when I first found it, Primark was super cheap, and so that does make sense that this would be known as a very cheap brand.
If you spend time in Ireland, our home market, or the UK, where we've been since the early 1970s, Primark is an absolute household name. We still have growth opportunities in Europe, but of course some of our countries, are certainly at a maturity point. The US is over 330 million consumers, and what we saw very quickly was a customer base that was responding incredibly well.
Primark has no e-commerce business in the US, and it relies on large brick and mortar stores, like this one in Queens, New York, which is 37,000 square feet of retail space.
That makes sense. I haven't tried looking online for a Primark. I don't often shop here, but having going to one of these stores, they're often huge spaces that you can basically spend a lot of time in. Like, they almost feel like the IKEA of clothing stores sometimes.
One of the reasons why Primark has been slow to expand online is because e-commerce is very expensive. It's a lot cheaper to have shoppers come to the store and take home what they buy. And so to keep margins up and prices low, their business model depends on being very efficient.
But Primark is just one name amongst many focused on US growth. Spanish retailer Mango and Canadian fashion brand Aritzia both made a splash in 2024. Mango grew its US sales by 10% and announced a $70 million expansion plan. Aritzia's stock price has soared over the past year as it grew US revenue by 9% in fiscal 2024. While these brands are currently in the midst of expansion, H&M laid the groundwork years ago for many of these names now taking on the US market.
H&M.
Yeah, agreed. I feel like H&M definitely came earlier and also entered the exact space that I think Primark has, which is very cheap, sort of fast fashion that exists. And so I think Primark might even be cheaper than H&M. And so I think this is where I feel like Primark has basically taken over those segments in those markets. In the US, as they've mentioned, there's not too many of them here. So especially in certain areas, they're not going to be in every mall, whereas maybe an H&M would be at this point. And so in the malls that they have a Primark, I feel like they have way more foot traffic than an H&M would.
H&M was really a trailblazer. It opened its first store about 25 years ago on New York's Fifth Avenue, and since then it's become a bit of a mall staple. It has about 500 stores across the country, and it's become a household name similar to a Gap or an Old Navy. Now it's fallen on trickier times because it's facing new competition from Shein, from Temu, from a lot of other specialty retailers that have cornered the market and come in and competed on fashion-forward trends.
Zara is another name that was at the forefront of global retailers moving to the US. However, the brand has grown its store base far more slowly than H&M. In fact, its net US store count has remained about the same over the past 5 years. But just looking at the number of stores doesn't tell the full story here.
They'll be expanding into these bigger flagship locations, and then those smaller stores that were existing in a given city, they might be actually closing them. Net, you still end up with more space, and net, the density of that space continues to increase every year.
I think what's interesting about a lot of these apparel retailers moving into the US is that they have something very distinctive, whether it's Inditex, which owns Zara with fast fashion, whether it's Mango with its kind of European style, Primark with its mix of ultra low prices and fast fashion, and Uniqlo, which has a focus on functional products, technical development. They all have something pretty distinctive, which I think gives them an advantage over kind of mid-range, undifferentiated apparel retailers.
More than 50% of Primark's offering is basics. Think t-shirts, underwear, socks, stuff that isn't going out of style. H&M is more fashion-focused, but similarly manufactures products far in advance in mainly China and Bangladesh, relying on its designers to predict trends and styles long before they hit stores. Rather than trying to predict trends, Zara, on the other hand, responds to them, operating under a traditional fast fashion model. Therefore, Zara is less reliant on manufacturing in Asia than some of its peers. About half of its production is done through nearshoring. All that means is the company produces things close to where it sells them. Inditex is based in Spain, and nearly 40% of its factories are based in Europe. It's therefore able to quickly stock product in the continent. But to get clothing on US shelves, while it's still in style, requires a different approach.
often a lot of the US product needs to be flown out there rather than shipped, right, to get there quickly enough. But that is very expensive. Air freight is much more expensive than sending something on a ship. As a result of that and differences in duties, taxes, costs of employment, rental costs, etc., the price points of items in the US for Zara are about 25 to 35% more expensive than.
Yeah, this I've definitely noticed. Zara's certainly, in my mind, a more expensive option than H&M or Primark. Certainly it's been noticeable for me. And it's interesting that they keep comparing them to an H&M or a Primark. So I do very little shopping in general, probably. But for me, I'm not sure if I noticed that much of a quality difference between Zara and H&M or Primark. And so again, that's where I think they even reference Uniqlo of they're sort of looking at functionality, which I interpreted as actual usable clothing for standard use. And so again, they don't seem to they have some fashion forward-ish items, but I feel like most of the things that I think about are pretty classics, like jeans, t-shirts, button-up shirts, sweaters, jackets, that type of thing. And so therefore they can kind of invest more in their actual clothing brand, whereas Zara and some of these other ones are more fashion forward. And so this might indicate that Zara isn't actually of higher quality, but they also might have a slight advantage. I'm not exactly sure. If any of you know, feel free to add it to the comments below.
The price points for those same items in its European business outside of Spain. But whereas when you look at H&M, the price points are very similar across most of its major markets. So you won't find a major discrepancy in prices in Europe versus the US.
The US retail market is highly fragmented, meaning there are a lot of companies vying for share of the customer's wallet.
Companies like Aritzia and Mango see fresh turf when they look over at the US, and they see a more resilient shopper. A lot of consumers in Europe, particularly in the UK, are under more economic pressure. In the US, there's been a more resilient consumer, and that consumer is willing to try new brands and follow global trends.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm not entirely sure why we wouldn't have other brands here. I feel like US is sort of like this mixing pot of a variety of things. And so I don't see why we would necessarily shy away from clothing that has come or brands that have come from other countries. And as they mentioned, US is so consumer driven that we spend way more per person than many other countries do. And so it's an obvious cash cow, so to speak, for any type of retailer in any space. So they're definitely going to want to have a footprint in the US if they can.
While that means increased competition, it also means new opportunities for growth. That dynamic is different in countries like Spain, where players like an Inditex already control a significant portion of the retail landscape.
They genuinely have an over 20% market share. So, if they're expanding in Spain, Zara, for instance, you really do feel that they're probably taking share from other players. When I look at Euromonitor data for Inditex's market share across the Americas, so North America, and it will include South America as well, it's like 1.5%, and H&M's won't be dramatically different. For context, if I look back a decade before, it was sort of 0.8%. So it's not that they aren't taking a little bit of share with their market rollout, but it's not really significant enough for me to see it as, they're taking material share in the US from other established players.
One of the opportunities that these companies have seen in the US is that department stores have weakened. This is not a news story, but as Macy's closes about 150 of its namesake stores, not only is that leaving a big box in malls that in some cases Primark could move into, but it's also leaving some market share on the table that's free for the taking. Another dynamic that could be appealing is the decline of baby and children's stores. Babies R Us and Bye Bye Baby, which is owned by Bed Bath & Beyond, both went out of business, and that means that Primark sees opportunity to grow its baby and children's market, which it's been doing at many of its stores.
See, athleisure is really big right now, with brands like Lululemon, Viore, Alo really taking off. This is Primark's answer to that, the $7 workout t-shirt.
We've been able to influence back on that global Primark product range to include more leisure wear as we've continued to grow over the US. We are about 5% of Primark's global sales today, so still relatively small in comparison to the other 16 countries in Europe. But actually, because of that growth, we're now able to shape more of the product range to suit the US consumer.
Social media has allowed brands with even a relatively small number of physical stores to flourish in the US. A Forrester retail survey found that 63% of consumers under 25 and 57% of those between 25 and 34 discover products or brands on social media at least weekly. Take the Uniqlo shoulder bag, for example.
I am serious, it's so nice.
Or the Aritzia Super Puff.
It is the warmest jacket I've ever worn.
Both companies cited social media virality as driving growth for these products in 2023. But one viral product does not keep a brand afloat. What it does create is brand awareness, which these companies can capitalize on by continuing to stay on top of trends.
Part of the appeal of these brands, whether it's Mango or Zara, is that they have a lot of off-the-runway looks. If you look on their website or in their app, a lot of the pictures look like something you might find in Vogue. They're very fashion-forward, tapping into that European ideal, that idea of being on the cutting edge of a trend, of looking like a model. That sort of newness is what's helping them attract new shoppers in the US who aren't as familiar with their brand but want to have that look, especially when they want to portray how fashion forward they are on TikTok or Instagram.
Despite its recent success, Uniqlo has had a bumpy road entering the US. After initially opening and closing stores in 2005 and 2006, it experienced some struggles again after re-entering in 2011. In fiscal 2016, the company reported losses of around $70 million related to asset retirement and store closures in the US.
Wow, I'm actually really surprised about that. I feel like, again, maybe some of these things were just a very small niche market, but I feel like if you look online for like Reddit or something like that, some of these forums are so pro Uniqlo that they basically don't recommend any other brand in some cases, and they'll just say like shoes, socks, underwear, hats, scarves, gloves, everything, just like buy everything that you need at this store. And so it seems to be a pretty well recommended item. Obviously that's not a huge share of the overall market, but I'm surprised because that generally seems to imply that people like this and it seemed to have a lot of repeat customers. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that Uniqlo is growing at the pace that they would need to. And so they might be investing early on to have sort of this drawdown of funds so that way they can place themselves as a leader in the market. So that way they can set themselves up and then plan to get benefits later on.
It was forced to reevaluate its strategy as it faced struggles with brand awareness and meeting the tastes of the American consumer. But today's retail landscape looks a bit different.
I think fashion is becoming more homogeneous around the world, and there are fewer differences to kind of iron out between markets. And I think that's playing into these kind of companies. So I think these probably stand a better chance than when we've seen in past years, past decades, companies move into a market and end up pulling out. There are kind of fundamental reasons why they should be more solid this time.
While fashion trends are becoming increasingly similar, regardless of the market, there are still differences in consumer preferences. Primark says its licensed merchandise, for example, is particularly popular in the US.
I think it's a Stitch cookie jar.
Yeah, that's a good point that they bring up. I feel like every time I go into a Primark, there's so many branded items, and especially as they mentioned there's less kid stores, I feel like this has to be a huge draw for them.
I love they're all in on Stitch in this section here.
But when it came to American sports apparel, the company quickly learned some valuable lessons.
Initially, we thought, surely everyone in Europe loves the Dallas Cowboys, and let's land that product into every store and everyone's going to absolutely go wild for it. Well, we saw pretty quickly that actually people are very passionate about their local sports teams. So if you're in Buffalo, in Walden Galleria where we trade, you better have the Bills product available for those customers because they're not looking for anything else.
The fragmented nature of the US apparel landscape makes it much easier for new players to enter. When Mango underwent significant growth in Spain, shoppers often assumed it was part of the Inditex portfolio of brands.
It can be difficult as a new brand to introduce yourself to a whole new group of customers who may not know your name. But many American customers travel a lot. There's been a shift toward going all over the world and discovering many of these retailers' names before a Mango opens in someone's own mall.
They're starting with a clean slate in some instances. At the same time, their brand image for a lot of these brands tends to be really quite consistent worldwide. They've got a formula that they've found has been distinctive, that has won the market share in many markets. It's kind of almost copying and pasting.
Most of these apparel names are still in the early innings of growth in the US. Aside from H&M, all of the brands discussed in this video have less than 100 physical stores. For context, Old Navy has over 1,100 locations.
Wow, that's actually pretty crazy. I'm going to go back to that for a second just because that was such a surprising stat that all of these have less than 100 stores. I think that makes sense. Certainly I've seen more Zara's than Mango's or Primark's. I'm actually kind of surprised that there's more Mango than Primark here, just because I feel like I've seen way more. I feel like maybe 3-4x Primark's to Mango, but maybe that's just the particular market I'm in. But this is actually very interesting to see. That it's crazy to think about how small this is compared to some of those other retailers. As they mentioned, I think Gap
have less than 100 physical stores. For context, Old Navy has over 11.
Old Navy. 1,100 is so many stores here.
100 locations. Primark told CNBC that it has 17 new leases signed for 2025. This map shows all but one, which the company has not yet announced.
We are only in 12 states today. When I think about Primark as a brand and the strength that we now have in the UK and the rest of Europe, to become a household name, to become part of the conversation, part of people's lives, is something that will take us time to get there, but I'm very sure that we're on that path for it.
Thank you so much and Assalamualaikum. Allah.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.